First, as a preface, a story. Once I was serving in a parish that had a large building, a large congregation, and I was approached by a member of the congregation who was also a distinguished professor at the nearby university, and he was interested in meeting with me, so we met together. He was very cordial, but his message was this: when you're preaching, you have the microphone on, so it's too strong. I sit a third of the way back and I'm getting an earache. And I looked at him and said, "Philip, I don't use a microphone." He looked a little sheepish, gave me a couple of his excellent books, and we've been friends ever since. So I say that by way of how I think I'm reasonably loud. However, if especially for those of you far away from me, if that dims down a little bit, just use that popular phrase we hear a lot today: "You're muted." It is both a pleasure and an honor to address the winter convocation of the Brothers of St. Gregory. As you just heard, my name is Charles Hoffacker, and I am a retired priest of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. 70 years have passed since my baptism and 40 since my ordination. From 1975 to 1980, I was a member of the Order of the Holy Family, an Episcopal monastic community in Denver, Colorado. We minister to transient young men, troubled adolescents, and people of the inner city. Founded in 1969, I understand that year has significance for you also. The Order of the Holy Family is now extinct, but I remain grateful for that extraordinary period in my life. Several new Episcopal communities arose in the 20th century, among them OHF and BSG. My soul is made glad by how you have persevered. If what I bring this week proves useful, my gladness will be multiplied. I look forward to individual and group conversations with you this week. My primary task, however, will be to deliver 3 addresses, one today, one tomorrow, and one on Thursday. Their collective title is Gregory's Prophetic Imagination and Our Own. In addressing this topic, I demonstrate my audacity. For not only is your brotherhood named for Gregory the Great, but I see by your rule that each of you is required to include in your annual reading a portion of his biography or his writings assigned by the Minister General at annual chapter. Thus, I find myself here, a speaker at a gathering made up of men who are already familiar to a remarkable degree with the life and writings of Gregory. I have not encountered such a gathering before. Thank you for your confidence in hoping that I will add a little something to your awareness of your patron saint and what he has to teach us all. Each of my 3 addresses will focus on an aspect of Gregory's work that I believe constitutes an example of prophetic ministry, consonant with Walter Brueggemann's influential study, The Prophetic Imagination. Perhaps you recall how Brueggemann defines the task of prophetic ministry. It is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. To nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. That's the task of prophetic ministry. I believe that Gregory took on this task in his time, and that it is for us and our contemporaries to do so now. In each of my addresses, I will focus on one aspect of Gregory's ministry. Allow me now to let this trio of cats out of the bag. The first aspect is how early in his life Gregory transformed his substantial real estate in Rome and Sicily into monasteries. The second is Gregory's authorship of dialogues, which recounts stories of wonder-working Italian saints, most prominently Benedict of Nursia. The final aspect is Gregory's concern for spreading the gospel outside the Roman Empire of his time, especially in Britain. My three presentations will extend beyond historical recital into the present and even the future. My intent is to help Gregorians look anew at their heritage, so that inspired and energized you can witness with increasing effectiveness a crossroads where Christ waits for you. But since the Gregorian heritage belongs to the whole church, I hope that what happens to you happens in some sense to us all, myself included. Namely, that our prophetic imagination will be powerfully refreshed so that we may serve Christ, our neighbor, in these things, in these times, which are both perplexing and promising. As Christians, all of us need a consciousness and perception, alternative to the consciousness and perception characteristic of the dominant culture. For this to happen requires of us gathered here today imaginative exercises that link elements not normally seen inside the same frame. These imaginative exercises call us to dare to leap into unfamiliar spaces. About a year ago, I came across a rewarding work of hagiography by Father John Julian, founder of the Order of Julian of Norwich, another Episcopal community dating from the previous century. This work is entitled Stars in a Dark World, Stories of the Saints and Holy Days of the Liturgy. Perhaps you're familiar with this massive work. If not, I commend it to your attention. When I read the entry on Gregory the Great, I was impressed to learn that his lineage includes 2 popes. But I was more impressed by his approach to real estate. Listen to Father John Julian's vigorous account. Then suddenly, at the age of 35, with no warning, this eminently successful young patrician, one of the richest men in Rome, did an about-face. Since his parents had died, he sold or gave away all his property, using it to found or endow 6 monasteries in Sicily and another in Rome. Then he converted his family mansion to yet another monastery dedicated to St. Andrew, appointed a holy monk, Valentius, as abbot, and turning his back on his astounding secular success, took the habit of a novice monk at the monastery which had been his family home. A Christian life can feature a series of conversions. Gregory's conversion to Christ included transforming multiple properties that belonged to his family inheritance into a series of monasteries, a series of gospel communities where Gregory was no longer the owner. These properties became part of something bigger. They could no longer be envisioned simply within private boundaries or urban boundaries or imperial boundaries, but became so many doorsteps, so many entry points to the kingdom of God. This revised perception, this radical act of stewardship, required an exercise of prophetic imagination that must have been at odds with Gregory's imagination when he began serving, and serving admirably, as what George G. Nicopolis calls the first man of Rome. Bear with me now as I bring all of this, ancient as it is, into play with something happening in our society, both national and international. To do so, I must turn our attention to an insightful book by Bruce Rogers Vaughan entitled Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. Despite the title, this is not a pastoral care manual. Instead, it is an exploration of how neoliberalism radicalizes individualism in ways that result in isolating, deadening forms of existence, calculated forms of existence, what Zygmunt Bauman calls the individualized society. One result of this process is what Rogers Vaughan refers to as third-order suffering. Part of the new chronic. We are all familiar with first and second order suffering. First order suffering, which simply accompanies the human condition, includes death, illness, grief, and much else. Second order suffering is distress caused by human evil, whether collective or individual, direct or indirect. Third order suffering arises alongside this other pair, and the three become entangled. This new variety occurs because people are spiritually homeless, left to their own devices to deal with distress. They lack the resources to make sense of what they are experiencing. All they have are dubious narratives of personal recovery provided to them by the market. Third order suffering often goes unrecognized even by its victims. The various forms of soul care have not yet developed adequate ways to address third order suffering and its various distortions of the first and second orders, a combination Bruce Rogers Vaughan identifies as the new chronic. Why is this new chronic new? It is a result of neoliberalism radicalizing plain old individualism. This happens in three ways. First, individuals become commodities in the market of consumption and labor. Second, reactionary intellectual consciousness dedicates itself to dismantling public space. Third, market deregulation expands into personal and public life. These three ways bring on unprecedented ways of suffering that constitute the new chronic. What does Bruce Rogers Vaughan see as the way to care for souls in a neoliberal age marked by acute spiritual homelessness? Collectives of the right kind. He explains, "It is my judgment that the primary challenge for pastoral care, psychotherapy, social activism, and other approaches to caring for souls today is not the effort to fix discrete social or rather personal problems, or even to redress specific social injustices. It is rather to aid people individually and collectively to find their footing, to articulate the deep meanings that ground their lives, and to strengthen healthy collectives and social movements that hold some residue of transcendent values." In other words, cultivating and strengthening religious collectives is the single most important thing pastoral and practical theologians can do to offer pastoral care in our time, but only if the community embodies the care of soul. Among the obstacles to such efforts is that neoliberalism drives a wedge between social concerns that focus on economic justice and those that focus on sexual, ethnic, and cultural identities. At the end of his book, Bruce Rogers Vaughan asserts that in our time of pervasive conformity and despair, collectives must amplify hope in a way that refuses to give precise measurements for the superior society it awaits. Hope thus exceeds optimism. It is not visualized, but something for which we dare to listen. This is exactly the path that Gregory followed in founding monasteries. For the kingdom of God is not a matter subject to precise measurements. Despite the symmetrical design of the New Jerusalem in the first great Christian poem, John's Apocalypse, instead, the commitments to such intangible realities as stewardship, chastity, obedience, and stability, the praying of psalms by night and day, all this, and so much else, constitute an effort to amplify hope for oneself, one's community, and the entire world. Though Rome itself was a wreck in Gregory's time, his monasteries were places where people dared to listen for hope and to amplify it for the benefit of all. In particular, the monastery of St. Andrew produced several bishops who as such oversaw in other places substantial communities dedicated to listening for hope and amplifying it, what the church now calls dioceses. It appears to me that the Brotherhood of St. Gregory follows in the footsteps of its patron saint. But I have a couple of questions for you. My first question concerns the listening for hope that I believe you do and that you help others to do. Simply put, what are you hearing? Your hearing in this regard may be shaped by distinctive features of the Gregorian way, In your version of religious life, marriage is not an impediment to membership. Also, yours is not a residential community. In religious communities that are attempting to retrofit large physical plants for an increasingly elderly and shrinking membership, there is a saying, the building always wins. BSG has no building and thus does not face this problem. Again, particular characteristics of your brotherhood probably do much to determine how individuals and a community you are. You do not visualize precise measurements for an optimism that is only human, but dare to listen for what God is saying amid a traumatized civilization. You listen in hope. So what is it that you are hearing? What do you hear that can help all of us find and keep our footing? The second question is this: how can those of us who call ourselves church strengthen other healthy collectives and social movements that hold some residue of transcendent values? Many Episcopal churches do this already, especially in urban areas. We do this for a variety of reasons that any of us here can recite. Perhaps we need to be conscious about one further reason, that any group with some sense of transcendent values may be a partner with us in resistance to the powerful forces at work in this society that would keep us from seeing every person as God's image and would have us mistake market forces for God. There will be time soon to gather in small groups and to discuss these and other questions. Let me remind you now that as a group and as individuals, you will bring great resources of experience and wisdom to the discussion. A consciousness and perception alternative to that of the dominant culture is available to us. It is close at hand.